Hello, and welcome to the presentation on social contract theory. This theory has been particularly influential not just in moral philosophy, but in political philosophy as well. It is a theory that attempts to explain our social obligations to one another. As always, you should have done the readings before viewing this presentation. With that said, let's get started. Social contract theory attempts to do two major things. First, it attempts to give a justification that legitimizes government and government coercion. Second, it attempts to show how a system of ethics can arise from a so-called state of nature in which one had much more, sometimes total, liberty. For Hobbes, whom we'll be primarily concerned with, ethics does not exist at all before the social contract. But for some other social contract theorists, such as Locke, ethical obligations do exist in the state of nature, but new obligations arise with the formation of the social contract. Social contract theory is the theory that ethical legitimacy of government comes from people mutually and voluntarily giving up their liberties to a common authority. In doing so, people enter what is called the social contract and take on particular ethical obligations, such as capitulating to the authority and its decisions. The state of nature. To understand why people might voluntarily sacrifice a portion of their liberties by entering into a social contract, I will ask you to engage in a thought experiment. Imagine the world before any organized government, before any local authority figures, before any system of arbitration of disputes, and before any laws, whether codified or by tradition. And imagine a world in which there is roughly equal need, that is to say, people need roughly the same basic things. Those things that we need are scarce to one degree or another. People are roughly equal in power, since even the very big and strong can be killed in their sleep or overpowered by a small group. Nobody is so powerful that they are completely safe from others. And a world in which altruism of others is limited. That is to say that others will not take care of all of our interests, especially in the face of scarcity and need. We call this the state of nature. In other words, the state of things before society and culture. So, really pause and try to picture the state of affairs in your mind. In such a situation, there's bound to be fierce competition for resources. According to Hobbes, since there are no laws, everybody has a right to everything, including each other's bodies. Everybody has a right to all and only what she can take and hold on to. But because of that, people cannot work together. Why is this? Because the fruit of one's labor is uncertain, and therefore the amount of work one will do is extremely limited. For example, it would make little sense, from a self-interested point of view, to take the time to plow a field and plant crops if you know that others are going to pick and eat the food you grow before you can, and that you have no real way of stopping them. For similar reasons, Hobbes thinks there is little point in making tools or constructing shelters and so forth. As Hobbes puts it in a very famous sentence, the life of man in the state of nature would be solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. For Hobbes, therefore, the state of nature is also a state of war, of all against all, where each may have exactly how much she may take and hold on to. It is worth noting that not all social contract theorists hypothesize such a brutal state of nature for man. Locke, for example, believes that people would generally be able to cooperate and work together in the state of nature, and thus some culture and technology would exist under Locke's theory. Nevertheless, for Locke too, the state of nature devolves into a state of war when an injustice is done and there is no common authority to settle the dispute. For Locke, individuals may morally seek out justice for themselves, or even for others. But the problem with this system is that personal bias will tend to lead to cycles of revenge and states of war. Why? Imagine that you are wronged in the state of nature. For Locke, you have a moral right to set things straight. So if you are stolen from, you have a right to enforce what he considers to be natural law and take your object back, even if force and harm are necessary to do this. One can defend themselves even into the death of one's opponent if one is under threat of being harmed. The problem with this, however, is that when people are harmed, they tend to view harms to themselves as worse than they actually are, and to exact a greater punishment than is justified. There's a fundamental problem with escaping from the state of nature. Consider two people who are sick of the state of war that results from the state of nature. Let's call them Og and Thrud. Og agrees that he will not steal things from Thrud's cave if Thrud agrees that he will not steal anything from Og's cave. Og agrees not to harm Thrud if Thrud agrees not to harm Og. So, now it seems that Thrud and Og can begin to better their lives. For example, it is now safe to cure animal pelts outside, invent the wheel, and store up surplus food, right? But not so fast. Does this really solve the problem? Pause and think about why it might not. There is no mechanism of enforcement of this new rule or agreement that Thrud and Og have reached. As soon as either one of them finds it convenient to do so, he might steal all the other's possessions or do the other violence. So, for example, Og might wait until Thrud has worked all season long farming and then take all his food. There's no common authority that's able to stop him from doing so. And since Thrud knows this, Thrud has little reason to actually trust Og and plant the fields in the hopes of reaping the benefits of his own labors. This was the problem that Hobbes noted. In order for Thrud and Og to escape the situation, there needs to be a common authority with the power to enforce the contract between Og and Thrud. So what is the solution? In order to escape the state of war, Og and Thrud and all other people come together and agree to invest an individual or group of individuals with the authority to make decisions and enforce their will upon the rest. This common authority, or commonwealth or sovereign, now has the power of the population behind her or him, and the ability to enforce laws that apply to everybody, and even contracts between individuals. Now Og and Thrud have a reason to keep to their agreements, because Ugg will beat them up if they don't. What is more, Og and Thrud have no legitimate complaint about Ugg using force against them, since they have voluntarily given Ugg the authority to do so. Let us set aside considerations of social contract theory for the moment and consider a famous and highly influential experiment from game theory known as the prisoner's dilemma. Many of you are probably familiar with seeing situations similar to this played out all the time in crime dramas if you ever watch shows like Law & Order, CSI, or NCIS. Imagine that you and a partner that you don't know well have been captured for a crime. The police capture you both and put you into separate rooms and say the following to you. We are going to give you the opportunity to confess your crimes. If you confess and your partner does not, they will let you go free and put your partner in jail for 10 years. We are, however, making the same offer to your partner, so decide fast. If he confesses and you do not, we will have the evidence needed against you to put you away for 10 years, and he will get off scot-free. So do you really want to serve time while he is out free? You ask what happens if neither of you confess, or if both of you confess. To be honest, if neither of you confess, we only have enough evidence to put both of you away for 1 year. But why spend a year in jail when you can go free? If you both confessed, you will each get 5 years in jail. This is known as the prisoner's dilemma. So, assuming that you are both rational and self-interested, what should you do? It might seem at first as if you should cooperate, that's to say not confess, with your partner, so that you each only get 1 year. But there are only 2 possible situations that you can find yourself in. Your partner will either cooperate with you, that's to say not confess, or your partner will defect against you and confess, so that he doesn't get any time in jail. Since there are only 2 options, you can figure out the best thing to do for each case. If your partner cooperates, then you should defect, because you get off free by doing so. But if your partner defects, then you should also defect, so that you only get 5 years in prison instead of 10. So no matter what your partner does, you should defect. But you seem to be stuck in something of a puzzle. Even though you know the rational thing to do on a whole, that's to say as a group, would be for you both to cooperate, the best thing for you to do as an individual is to always defect. The problem is made even worse by the fact that your partner is probably rational too, and so will reason in the same way. Thus you will always both defect and be stuck with one of the worst possible outcomes. Note that, much like with the case of Og and Thrud, simply being able to talk to your partner doesn't solve the problem. Even if you and your partner agreed ahead of time not to confess, it is still rational for him to betray you. So even if you both agreed ahead of time never to confess so that you each get at most 1 year in prison, you are still faced with the fact that the rational self-interested thing to do in each case is still to defect. If your partner keeps his bargain, then you can get no years by confessing. And if your partner betrays you, then you are still better off betraying him right back so that you only get 5 years instead of 10. Note, however, that if you both belong to some sort of syndicate, and your mob boss said that if either of you rat on the other you'll be whacked in prison, then, since there is now a mutual authority able to enforce cooperation, you and your partner are able to get the optimal group outcome. The mob boss in this case is playing a similar or analogous role to the sovereign or commonwealth role in social contract theory. She or he can enforce societal rules. There is an interesting side note, however. It does turn out that just psychologically, when people run this game with each other, they are more likely to cooperate if they talk to each other beforehand, in spite of the fact that the rational decision and what is rational to do doesn't change. Of course, how likely they are to trust each other depends in part on the stakes. The prisoner's dilemma is interesting from more than just a theoretical perspective. People find themselves in real-life situations that parallel the prisoner's dilemma situation all the time. In your dealings with other people, for example, you could always behave selfishly, or you can concern yourself altruistically with other people's interests as well as your own. You might recognize this conflict from theories such as ethical egoism versus ethical altruism. Now, in the meantime, other people are making the same decision about how to behave towards you. This puts you in a prisoner's dilemma type case. You could act selfishly or somewhat altruistically. If people act altruistically towards you, it seems like you still benefit from being selfish towards them. This is sometimes called being a free rider. If, on the other hand, they are selfish towards you, then you don't gain anything by being altruistic towards them. Again, it seems like, however it is that other people behave, as a self-interested individual, you should take the selfish course of action. But of course, if other people reason the same way, then everybody will act selfishly, which will put you in the second worst possible situation, everybody being selfish. The very worst situation from a self-interested perspective would be for you to be altruistic while everybody else is selfish. The way to escape from the prisoner's dilemma is to have some mechanism to enforce cooperation. So you should be seeing the analogy between the prisoner's dilemma and the situation people are in the state of nature. Though Rachels does not mention this in his chapter, one way that this can happen in the prisoner's dilemma game is if the prisoner's dilemma game is going to be repeated an unspecified number of times. This mimics the fact that you will often likely deal with the same people repeatedly, although you don't know how often in your life. In other words, you are not playing a one-time game. If you know, or even believe, that you may have to deal with a particular partner in another prisoner's dilemma type situation again, there is now a way to partially escape the problem. If you betray your partner this time, then it is likely that your partner will punish you for betraying her next time by not cooperating with you. In order to avoid this, you may both decide to cooperate, which can lead to the second best payoff from a self-interested standpoint. The best is, of course, being selfish, while the other person is altruistic from a self-interested standpoint. For example, suppose that your neighbor loans you his drill when you need it. But when he wants to borrow something, like a soldering iron, you selfishly say no. It is likely that the next time you ask to borrow something from your neighbor in the future, he will say no as well. So even though you came out ahead in one case, you are costing yourself in the long run. You win the battle but lose the war, so to speak. If, however, you loan your neighbor the tool he wants, you may be able to continue this useful relationship of sharing possessions to your mutual benefit for many years to come. During most of human evolution, people were limited to small groups, and thus repeated interactions were even more sure than they are today. This may help explain why people tend to be cooperative instead of purely selfish. Under this view, people evolved instincts as adaptations that cause them to be so instinctively. In game theory, this is known as the tit-for-tat strategy, and it has been shown to be one of the most successful strategies for prisoner's dilemma type situations. Of course, the tit-for-tat strategy works best when each person expects that her continued gain from the relationship will outweigh the benefits of a one-time cheat or betrayal. but in the state of nature, there would be many circumstances where betraying others would pay. Hobbes believes that, in order to lead the state of nature, the people get together and invest a sovereign with the authority to use force or coercion to enforce her or his will. The sovereign can then enforce laws and agreements. Further, each can have no complaint about this because each voluntarily gave up his or her liberty. In this way, people can't harm each other with immunity because now there is a government that will punish them for doing so. For Hobbes, people continue to support the government and to give so much of their will over to the sovereign because the alternative is the state of nature, which he sees as so horrible. Hobbes sees almost no limits for the sovereign, who may act in her own interest and owes the people nothing, though the sovereign herself usually benefits from law and order, which tends to benefit the people as well. The only thing, according to Hobbes, that a person cannot be understood by the contract to give away to the sovereign is the right to defend her life or defend against serious harm, since that is the whole reason for entering into the contract in the first place. Other social contract theorists, like Locke, see the government as existing purely for the sake of the people who created it and invested it with their liberties and authority, and believes that everything that the government does, therefore, needs to be justified by the good of those who form the contract. Rachels lists three major advantages that social contract theory seems to provide. First, if we put aside Hobbes' extreme sovereign and look at the purpose of the social contract, there seems to be a limit on the types of rules that we are morally required by the contract to follow. In order to live together and cooperate, rules against theft and physical harm, for example, are necessary. But rules against what are typically called consensual crimes, however, do not fall under this category. Laws limiting certain types of consensual sexual behavior or private religious practices, or perhaps even particular types of drug use, would not seem to be legitimate laws under the social contract. Social contract theory explains why it's rational to be moral. One part of being moral in this framework is fear of being punished, but there's more to it than that. Much as in the case with the prisoner's dilemma, one is moral under this framework so that others will be moral as well. As Rachels puts it, we form a firm intention to act according to the contract because we expect others to have such an intention as well. Thirdly, the system can show that rule breaking is sometimes okay. For example, when other people violate the contract, some of their normal liberties might be taken away when doing so would be against the social contract otherwise. Fourth, limits to what morality can demand from us. In some moral theories, if we are to be objective, it would seem as if we would have to sacrifice our own life to save the lives of more than one other, since two is greater than one. Social contract theory, however, only obligates us to follow those rules we can reasonably expect others to follow as well. Another advantage that Rachel sees to social contract theory is the idea that under particular circumstances, such as the treatment of African Americans under racist Jim Crow laws, civil disobedience is justified. The reasoning is as follows. To enter the social contract, each person gives up some liberties with the understanding that others will give up like liberties for the sake of mutual social benefit. In other words, everybody accepts a particular set of burdens for the sake of a particular set of benefits. In a systematically racist society, one or more groups of people are receiving a larger set of burdens of the society than others, and are not receiving the benefits that they are owed under the social contract. Since society is breaking its social contract with the oppressed group itself is no longer reasonably has the same burden to follow the society's laws. It would be as if you entered a contract to receive cable television, and then one day Time Warner began charging you 90% more money and not giving you any cable service except for 3 static-filled channels. If you had not agreed to this change in price and service, withholding payment until your normal service is returned is a reasonable course of action. Or instead, you can imagine a tenant who pays for a heated apartment who has a landlord that will not fix the heater, and so finally, out of desperation, begins to withhold rent. Social contract theory does, however, have several problems associated with it. There are 2 major objections to the theory that Rachels covers. First, social contract theory is based on historical fiction. Second, some morally important groups are left out of the contract. The first objection, that social contract theory is based on historical fiction, objects to the theory by pointing out that none of us ever actually got together and agreed to any kind of contract. Likewise, there is no historical evidence that any of our distant relatives ever got together and held such a meeting. And even if they did, why would it be binding for you? The problem with this objection is that I don't know of a single social contract theorist who has ever thought that there was actually a historical moment where a contract was made in the way described above. Instead, the typical social contract theory response is to claim that even though there was no historical event whereby people explicitly agreed to such a contract, people implicitly agreed to the contract by accepting the benefits that one can only gain if others sacrifice some of their liberties by obeying the rules. By accepting these benefits and encouraging others to obey the rules, it is argued that we are in effect saying that we have agreed to behave likewise, even though we never explicitly made such a contract. By accepting society's benefits, it is argued that one also accepts its burdens. Rachels, however, argues that this response is insufficient because people would be forced to enter into the contract by their circumstances. Somebody born too poor to move away, for example, would have no choice but to be part of the social contract of the society she is in. But a contract entered under duress isn't a legitimate contract at all, and so Rachels doesn't think that this response is adequate. A second response that the social contract theorist can make is to claim that participating in the social contract is the only rational thing to do. Rather than live in a state of nature, it is rational for a person to give up a portion of their liberties to live in social harmony, and that if somebody refuses to do this, then that person is behaving irrationally. The argument then is that since a person would be behaving irrationally, she does not legitimately have that option. The problem with the social contract theorists taking this line of defense, however, is that it no longer appeals solely to the authority of the mutual agreement behind the social contract itself for moral justification. Instead, it seems to be saying that we are obligated to do whatever is the most rational thing to do, or, at the very least, that rationality is a vital component of this agreement. But as Rachels points out, a social contract theorist could take this line and then hold morality consists in the set of rules governing behavior that rational people will accept on the condition that others accept them as well. This is a position very similar to that of John Rawls, but discussing his work would bring us beyond the scope of this chapter. The second objection, and the one that Rachels believes is the strongest, is that some morally important groups are left out of social contract theory. Now remember that the purpose of social contract theory is to come together for mutual benefit. Thus only those beings that can benefit us can be part of the contract. This seems to leave out human infants, non-human animals, future generations of people, populations of people that are powerless to benefit us, people with severe enough disabilities. Rachels thinks that this objection goes right to the root of the tree of social contract theory and undermines the theory. Since the theory is grounded in mutual self-interest, it cannot take into account those who do not serve the interest of those in the contract. Do you think Rachels is right? And do you think a social contract theorist could have a response? And that is the end of this presentation. Until next time.